Good morning, everybody. Welcome to a wet and windy Nottingham. I wonder what it's like where you are. And today's webinar, 15 best ways to quickly grow your newsletter database. So you've got me and Dan today. Abby's not with us today. She'll be returning next month. You might have known on your way into the webinar that there's a poll that we'd like you to answer. So if you could answer those questions right now, that question right now, if you've not already done so, we'd really appreciate it. And I'll hand over to my glamorous assistant, Dan, to do the housekeeping.
Oh, wonderful. It's nice to be glamorous today, as well as being the assistant. So I'm Dan, and I'll be your extremely glamorous assistant today. So I'll be keeping us on track and on time, asking all of your questions. And I assume, time permitting, Phil might saw me in half, I guess. The lengths I go to for you lovely people, sawn in half. So, what do we need to know before we begin? First of all, we are recording this session, so don't worry if you miss anything. A follow-up email with a link to the video, plus any notes, resources, or links that we mention will be landing in your inbox later on. And secondly, make sure you get your questions in. So you can use the chat function or the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring both and reading them out at regular intervals. And it doesn't really even need to be a question. We love reading your opinions, your agreements, your disagreements, or just general anecdotes of things that are working for you. So shout up if we're speaking sense, speaking rubbish, or you just want Phil to stop sawing me in half. Get involved and let's learn as much as we can in the next hour, myself and Phil included. So speaking of Phil, let's give him the stage so he can tell us the 15 best ways to add some numbers to our newsletter database.
Thanks, Dan. And we'll come back to the poll results in a minute because I can't see those. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about GDPR and newsletter signups. Because we need to get GDPR right if we're going to build newsletter databases. And we're going to talk about newsletter sign-up pages. We're going to talk about how to build that newsletter sign-up page. We've got a special offer for you there. And then we're going to talk about 15 ways. We're going to give you those 15 ways to grow your newsletter database. And we always want to start with the end in mind and work backwards. And it was Simon Sinek who said, start with why. So seemed an obvious place to start. Why do we want to grow our newsletter database? Why do we want to grow our newsletter database? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Only 3% of people are in market ready to engage with a marketing agency, a financial advisor, a financial planner, a mortgage broker any single time. Only about 3% are ready to engage at any single time. And that means that the larger your database, the larger that number of 3% work out to be. Take our webinar today. We sent our database the invite. You all received that. You signed. If our database had been all the size, we could logically have expected, assuming the quality of that extra data was as good as the original data, we could have logically expected to double the number of attendees today. So the larger your database, just in absolute numbers, the higher that 3% figure is. And of course, that expanded reach extends to the reasons why we send newsletters in the first place. That the newsletters position you as if you get them right, as a go-to expert, or in the case of prospects, which we'll talk about in a bit, a go-back-to expert when the prospect is ready to act. And as I said, your newsletter nurtures prospects, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And it also nurtures clients while you are onboarding them. So, as I understand it, right now you talk to financial advisors and planners, and one of the things that they're finding difficult right now is response times from product providers. They can be long, and that means it can take a while to engage a new client, which might mean that the client, for a period of time, things have gone a little bit quiet. Whereas if you're sending them a weekly or monthly newsletter, it means they're hearing from you on a regular basis. So your newsletter helps to nurture those people, but as we'll see in a bit, it only does that if you add prospects and clients into your database. There are also economies of scale here. Generally speaking, not always the case with some mailing systems. Generally speaking, if you send your newsletter to 2,000 people compared to 1,000 people, there's no increase in cost. So, for example, we've got a client at Yardstick. Up until December, so October, November, December's newsletter was going out to about 600 people. In January, they took our advice and the newsletter database grew to about 1,700 people from 600 and didn't increase the cost. We didn't charge them more for sending it to more people. So there's some economies of scale there. You can also use your newsletter database, of course, to promote other forms of content. Everybody at Yardstick on our database gets our newsletter on a Friday morning at 7:30 a.m. and you all get our webinar invites. So you can use your newsletter database to promote other events as well. But we do need to think about quality versus quantity. You can buy a ton of data relatively easy on the internet. The quality would be dubious to say the least. So this isn't all about quantity. We do need to think about quality as well, which takes us into a few words of warning. And Dan, I'm going to get you to get the poll up in a minute, if that's okay. So your newsletter, it's really, really important that your newsletter adds value. Sure, you want to tell people about things that are going on in your business, wins, good stuff that's happening. Absolutely, you want to do that. But your newsletter has to add value. We talk a lot about this about social media. Yeah, that value added piece. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be interesting. It's got to add value to them, to the people who receive it. That means it's got to be high quality and it's got to be sent consistently. It's the hill I will die on, that newsletters should be sent on a monthly basis at the minimum. So Dan, that's a good point to go back to you and just ask about the poll.
Yeah, so we've had lots of votes, and those that send client newsletters weekly, we've got 6% of the audience. So 2 big claps for those 6% doing great work. Then monthly, this is the overwhelming majority. Monthly has got 62%. So great work there. We've got 11% of the attendees quarterly. Then we've got a 9% of the pie chart being that mysterious different frequency. So not weekly, not monthly, not quarterly, something different. So do tell us in the chat what that is, because I'll be very eager to learn that. And then at the end, we've got 12% of the audience that don't send newsletters currently.
Cheers, Dan. So really pleased we have maybe 2/3 sending newsletters monthly or with a higher frequency than that. That's really good news. Like Dan said, if you put other in there, tell us what the other is. If you put quarterly in there, tell us why you feel that quarterly is the right frequency for you. But this isn't a webinar about why we should send newsletters monthly. We will put a link in the chat and in the follow-up to one of the definitive guides that we've written online. Dan, maybe you could just look that up. It's definitive guides to the 7 reasons why newsletters should be sent monthly. And we also need to, on a lot of this stuff, check our mindset. I hear a lot of myths, misconceptions, and limiting beliefs, not only about the frequency that newsletters are sent, but also on things like GDPR. And we're going to cover that off. We're going to cover that off in a minute. So let's avoid those myths, misconceptions, and limiting beliefs. Open our minds and hopefully increase the size of our newsletter database. Now, to do that, we need to prepare and essentially get 2 things right. We need a newsletter sign-up page. So we're going to use that with some of the concepts and ideas, some of the 15 concepts and ideas we talk about as we work through this webinar. And we also need to have a basic understanding of GDPR compliance. So this is where I want to go for the next couple of minutes. And what we're looking for is we need a newsletter sign-up page, a dedicated newsletter sign-up page on your website to make a lot of today's tactics work. And ideally, the page should include a positioning statement. So what they'll get if they sign up, when they will get it. Link to your privacy policy to confirm that it's been read. And then a simple form with someone's name and email address. And then error and success messages. And people often forget the error and success messages. So your error message is a message that pops up if someone doesn't complete one of the data fields or doesn't tick the GDPR privacy notice that they've read that. The success message is what happens when they have successfully signed up, as the name might suggest, to your newsletter, and just tells them again what to expect and when to expect it. So you can see the example on the Yardstick website. We've got a bit of positioning text at the top. We want people's first name, last name, and email address. And you've got the checkbox for the yes, we've read the privacy policy. Who knows how many people read the privacy policy? How many times do you read the contract when you accept something from signing up for an app or something like that? It's important it's there. So the first thing we need, as I say, to make a lot of these tactics work is to build on your website a dedicated newsletter sign-up page. What we want to avoid is sending people to a homepage and then telling people you've got to scroll down to find the newsletter sign-up. This is a dedicated page to help people sign up for your newsletter. And we're going to use this in some of the tactics that we've spoken about or we'll speak about in a minute. Now, if you don't have that dedicated newsletter page and you want us to build it for you, I have twisted our digital team's arm, plied them with alcohol, and they are happy to build newsletter dedicated sign-up pages for $197 plus VAT. We're only doing this for people who are on the webinar today. And if you want us to do that for you, just drop across a message to Dan with your name and email address, and we'll be in touch with next steps. But as I say, you do need that dedicated sign-up page for some of the tactics that we're going to talk about today. The other thing you need to have is a basic understanding of GDPR. Now, GDPR came into effect on the 25th of May, 2018. So GDPR has been around for nearly 6 years. And it has increased our awareness of data protection. I'm not entirely sure it's increased most people's understanding of data protection regulations because there are still so many myths, misconceptions. And one of those myths, misconceptions is that you need consent to process somebody's data. And in this context, processing someone's data is sending them a newsletter. And there are 6 legal bases for processing somebody's data. The 3 that are applicable in this circumstance, or potentially applicable in this circumstance and people on this webinar, are consent, contractual obligation, and legitimate interest. And this is a quote taken from the ICO website. No single basis is better or more appropriate than the others. Which basis is most appropriate to use will depend on your purpose and the relationship with the individual. So there's no hierarchy here. They are all equally valid. And our recommendation is generally, when it comes to the tactics that we're going to talk about today, is to rely on legitimate interest as the basis for which you are processing people's data and sending them a newsletter. So one of your actions after today is to go and review the privacy policy on your website. First of all, make sure it's there. I was on a financial advisor's website earlier this week, clicked the privacy policy because I'm a bit dull like that, and broken link, got a 404 error. That's not going to look good to anybody. Yeah. So first thing, make sure your privacy policy is on your website and it's working. and then make sure that you have the correct legal bases under GDPR for sending people a newsletter in your privacy policy. And if I were you, I would rely on legitimate interest. If anybody's got any questions about GDPR, happy to try and take them now. If I don't know the answers, really happy to take them offline. So those are two assets that you need to prepare yourself for growing your newsletter database. We need the page on the website, and we need to make sure your privacy policy is correct. And then we can start diving in. So the first of the 15, make sure that all your clients are in your newsletter database. We speak to a lot of firms who set up a newsletter weekly, monthly, quarterly if they have to, but they set up a newsletter and they forget to add all their clients into the database, which is a bit bizarre, but they forget to add all their clients in. And that might be because they've got some historical clients that did transactional business a few years ago. It might be because their processes aren't very good. It might be because they've got that misunderstanding about GDPR and that they need consent to send clients newsletters. Whatever the reason, you just need to make sure that all your clients, job number one, are in your newsletter database until they ask you to unsubscribe them or they ask to be removed. And of course, if at any point they say, please will you take me out of the newsletter database, you 100% need to do it. So first job, check all your clients are in your newsletter database. Second job, make sure you are adding all new enquiries into your newsletter database. Now, this is really important. Let's face it, most firms have got their clients in the newsletter database, some don't. The flip is true here. Most firms do not add new inquiries into their newsletter database. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But let's look at this more positively and look at the reasons why you would add prospects into your newsletter database. And the reason is very simple. Every single new prospect that comes to you can be fitted into one of three boxes. First box is that they convert immediately, you like them, they love you, everything's fantastic, no doubt they're going to become a client. That's brilliant. In which case, they're in your newsletter database because you add in clients. The opposite is true. Unless something changes with them, unless something changes with you, they're never going to become a client. The fit just isn't right. It's fine, it happens. The middle box is the box that I want to talk about. And the middle box are people that you know you can add value to. You would love to work with them as a client, but for whatever reason, they don't immediately engage. So for those people, you've got two choices. The first choice is that you ignore them. You forget about them. You never go back to them. You never do anything to try and nurture them and convert them from prospect into client. Now, clearly that's the wrong thing to do because that's going to reduce your conversion rate. It means you're wasting the time and money you've invested generating them as a prospect in the first place. So we need to nurture these prospects so that when they're ready, when they move from the 97% to the 3% and they move in market, it's you that they come back to rather than starting their search somewhere else or restarting their search. So your newsletter is the foundation on turning you and your business into the go back to expert, the go back to expert. And you can't do that unless you're recording their new inquiries and you're then adding them to your newsletter database. And that's why all prospects need to be in your newsletter database. And that's answer number 2. So go back after this webinar, check that you are recording all new prospects somewhere in your back office system, sales-based CRM, or the yardstick template that we've produced and you can have if you want that. And then make sure they're being added into your database. Dan, I can see a couple of questions coming in. Anything we need to deal with?
Yeah. So We've got two questions in from the same. Well, I'm assuming they're the same person. It's another anonymous attendee. I love these questions, mysterious. So, if I do a newsletter to a following I've built from LinkedIn and work for an IFA that has a clear privacy notice, do I need to include the privacy notice in the newsletter, or is having it on the wider company's website sufficient? And a caveat to that, they've said, to clarify, they are currently a mixture of clients and prospects, but have all given consent to be added.
So generally speaking, as far as I'm concerned, if the privacy policy is on the website, then that's fine. Doesn't need to be in the newsletter as well. If you want to put it in the newsletter as well, in the footer, so your footer of the newsletter mirrors the website, absolutely no harm in doing that.
And by
I
that, you
think
mean
that's it.
link to the page as opposed to any actual nuts and bolts text, right?
Oh, correct. Yeah, yeah. You just have the words privacy policy, hyperlink that to the privacy policy on the website.
Brilliant. That's all for questions right now. So keep them coming in, guys.
Fair enough. Thank you, anonymous Mr. or Mrs. User. So, networking. I don't know how many people physically go to networking events these days. It used to be a thing years ago, but I'm not sure how often people go to physical networking events these days. But if you do, why not add the people you meet at those networking events to your newsletter database? I think there's probably two types of people you meet at networking events. The first is those transient people that come in and out. And then the others are those groups, those type groups like BNI, things like that, where you're seeing the same people every week. I would be inclined to add those people to your newsletter database. So they're hearing from you on a regular basis, because at some point they might move from the 97% into the 3% and move in market for financial advice or financial planning or mortgage advice. And they might talk to other people. Networkers, by dint of going to networking events, talk to people, don't they? That's what they do. So if they hear from you on a regular basis and financial advice, financial planning, mortgage advice crops up in conversation, if they hear from you on a regular basis and you've added value, who are they going to recommend? It's going to be you. Number 4, your website. So I would always recommend adding a newsletter sign-up form to your website. Always recommend adding a newsletter sign-up form to your website. But don't overestimate the number of people who will actually click it. And in the 7 years Yardstick has been going, and last month we got 12,000 visits to our website. We've probably averaged about 4,000 or 5,000 each month in the year in those 7 years. I think we've had fewer than 500 people sign up to our newsletter via the form on our website. Website visitors don't typically, there's other things we can do, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they don't typically complete newsletter sign-up forms. So if you only did this, if you only did number 4, we're going to grow our database really quite slowly. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And you can add that newsletter sign-up form to key pages on your website. Now, this is different. It is different to that form that we're talking about here. So the form is a dedicated landing page we're going to use, or we're going to recommend you use, in other ways, which we'll get to in a minute. What I'm talking about here is a dedicated newsletter sign-up form that will probably look a little bit similar to a kind of callback contact us form that goes on the key pages of your website. Ideally then, for extra brownie points, that form would automatically be linked to an address book in your mailing system. And as soon as somebody signs up to the newsletter, they get a first email coming out saying, expect the next newsletter next month. In the meantime, here are our greatest hits. Here are some articles you can read. So I would be adding, as we've got it in here, number 4, a newsletter sign-up section to key pages on the website. Just, we need to do more. Don't think job done when we've done that. Number 5, you could consider adding a pop-up on your website, inviting people to sign up for the newsletter. Now, pop-ups tend to divide opinion. They tend to divide opinion a little bit. But they can be incredibly useful. And the first thing that tends to divide opinion is the pop-up that shows too quickly. Yeah, as soon as you land on someone's website, instantly a pop-up comes up asking, do they want to take a certain call to action? Sign up to a newsletter, sign up to a webinar, make an inquiry. And the answer is no, I'm looking around your website. I didn't come to see this pop-up, I'm looking around the website. So we need to be careful about a pop-up appearing too quickly. But if your pop-up can be set, and they absolutely can, so they appear after 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 60 seconds of someone being on the website. And they don't appear again on every single page. So if someone dismisses it, goes to another page, the pop-up doesn't appear again. We don't want people playing whack-a-mole with a pop-up. I'd also set it so that if they come back a week's time and they've dismissed the pop-up, they don't get to see it again. Then I think pop-ups have a part to play. So I would say use them carefully, use them judiciously, make sure that they don't pop up as soon as somebody hits the website, but they can work well. The other thing, of course, if we build a pop-up functionality on an advisor's website, you can turn the pop-up on and off, and you can also change the message. So I know there's some people on this webinar today who do newsletters and are also running webinars for their own clients. Big fan of you advisors that are running webinars for your own clients. And that pop-up could change. So for a period of time when you're not promoting a webinar, it could be a newsletter sign-up. It will be turned off. When you are promoting a webinar, we could change the message on the pop-up very easily so that it talks about the webinar that you're running. So number 5, consider adding a pop-up on the website. So those are some things that we talk about on the website. Let's talk about some things on LinkedIn. So what could you do on LinkedIn to try and increase your newsletter audience? So here are a few ideas. Add a newsletter sign-up call to action at the end of your LinkedIn posts. Now, this is the first time we're going to use that page on your website. We're going to use that page on your website, or the equivalent on your website of what we've got there. So add a newsletter sign-up call to action at the end of your LinkedIn posts. So here's a good example of that. This was my post on Saturday morning. You can just about see Caffè Nero behind my laptop. A deserted Caffè Nero at that time behind my laptop. And you can see the bit I've got in yellow, clearly on LinkedIn, the yellow box is not there. I just put that on there to highlight this. Want more? Practical insights, hints and tips, etc., etc. And I put the subscribe link in the comments. And the subscribe link is then linking back to that page. And that's the first time we would deploy that page. And we always, whenever I put that on, get people signing up for our newsletters. And if you are seen as the good person, if you're seen as someone who's adding value and providing important information through your LinkedIn post, that's above, you can't see, and you don't have a different call to action, then use something like that. The want more, there's no functionality in LinkedIn. There's no formatting functionality in LinkedIn. So you need to go to something like Yeatext. If you just Google Yeatext, type in what you want, copy and paste in the correct formatting, and you can start getting that in there. The little hand pointing down, you get from Emojipedia. Dan looks as though he's getting the links for those as we speak.
Yeah, I'll pop something in the chat in a few minutes.
Thanks, Dan. So using LinkedIn, add a newsletter sign-up call to action at the end of your LinkedIn posts. You can absolutely do it on Twitter as well. We'll show an example of that in a bit. Then consider adding a custom button to your LinkedIn profile and then link that to your newsletter sign-up page. Now, the custom button is this bit that I've highlighted in yellow on my profile. It's only available unfortunately, if you have a premium membership of LinkedIn. Personally, I think premium membership is worth it. But I know different people have different views on that. But that custom button is, as I say, available if you've got premium membership. And you can change it on a pretty regular basis. So you can see here, I had put sign up for February's free webinar. The number of characters I had meant I couldn't put the title into there. And that links through as a little box in the arrow denotes to our registration page. Now, because I put a tracking link on that, I know that people have clicked that and people have signed up today's webinar from clicking that button. So after today's webinar, I might change that to sign up to our newsletter, visit our website, come to March's webinar. But if you have LinkedIn Premium, you can add that custom button and you can push it to anywhere. Consider pushing it to your newsletter sign-up page and see how many people sign up because of it. So number 7, use that custom button if you've got LinkedIn, a LinkedIn paid for membership. Dan, anything come in the chat that we need to deal with?
No, so we obviously had a few anonymous questions through the Q&A box, but we've had nothing through the chat function yet. So there's 2 solutions to what that may be. It may be that we've had no questions through the chat, or the chat's not working. So could 1 or 2 of you in the attendees list just pop something through on the chat so I know it's working? Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I just wanted to double check I hadn't disabled a feature by accident. Lovely. Thanks, Sally, Daniel, Jesse, Mark. Yeah, thanks to you all.
Okay, right. It's a bit controversial here. Yeah. So if you've got views on this, tell me in the chat. But one of the things you could consider doing, I'm just giving myself a few outs here, is to move your LinkedIn connections into your newsletter database. Now, it sounds as though our anonymous attendee had done this. And I've got sort of conflicting views on this. But if you are connected with people on LinkedIn, I have seen 2 or 3 advice firms take all those connections out of LinkedIn and add them into the newsletter database. Now, my gut feel at that point was that they were going to get a load of GDPR complaints. They were going to get a lot of people saying, what's gone on? I don't want to do this. I don't want to receive this. You know what? They absolutely didn't. The unsubscribe rate stayed pretty static. Nobody marked it as spam, because you can tell how many people mark it spam. Nobody marked it as spam. And they increased their newsletter database really quite significantly. And that means that those people on LinkedIn are then hearing from the firm or the individuals in question on LinkedIn and via the email newsletter. That has to be a good thing. Practically speaking, there's a bit of work involved. So you can download easily enough all your connections from LinkedIn. You can download a spreadsheet of all your connections on LinkedIn. It will only show you the email addresses for about 10%, really small number. So you end up with a column for email addresses and just a huge number of blanks in there. You need to fill those blanks in. It's a manual job for somebody in your business. You could push it out to something like people per hour. And you can also use little AI tools. So I'm still a bit on the fence about this. Yardstick, we've not done it. But I've seen advisors who have done it and it's worked really well for them. So who am I to say that they shouldn't do it? Dan, any questions on that more controversial one? Or any questions about anything we've spoken about so far?
Yeah, we've got some questions come through. So great question in from Chris, who says, so 2 questions, Phil. Are before you leave, i.e. just as someone looks like they're leaving a website, pop-ups both possible or effective, and are they worth considering?
So are they possible? Absolutely. Are they worth considering? I hate them. I'm a data set of 1. Yeah, I'm a data set of 1. So that's an anecdote rather than evidence. So for me, I would try it. Why not give it a go? Put an exit pop-up on your website. Make sure you can track it though. So let's say you've got a newsletter sign-up form, a newsletter sign-up page, a pop-up during the normal scheme of things, and an exit pop-up, or some combination of. You need your developer to set them up so you can track who has completed which form, so you know what's working and what's not. But hey, yeah, give it a go, Chris. Tell me how you get on with it.
Hey, we have a second question in from Chris. So Chris says, sorry, second question. You never need to apologize for another question, Chris. We want as many as we can get. What are your thoughts about calling your newsletter something different? This might be a personal preference, but I'm not sure I like the idea of a newsletter, but I like the idea of a different naming convention.
Yeah, I completely get on board with that. Um, I mean, some firms call it newsletter. Other firms give it a specific name. I don't really mind what you call it. Your monthly electronic email style communication. I don't really care what you call it, as long as you send it consistently. It adds value and it ticks off a few other kind of things that I would always suggest that you do. But I love the idea of calling it something. Your podcast, Chris, is called the Kindness Project, I think. Maybe link it to that. I would absolutely play around with some of those ideas. Really supportive of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I've got a lot of newsletters I subscribe to, and it's, newsletter is rarely used. It's the club, it's the community, it's the group, isn't it? There's a lot of words that bring things into slightly more of a warmer context, which might work. Right, we've got time for one more question before we move on.
Sure.
Lovely. Another anonymous attendee. Well, I promise you it's not me asking these. I promise you there is somebody there. Hi, my company are part of the Catena network for Nottingham-based businesses. They have a database of contacts who use the site. We do have access to this. Would this come under legitimate interest, or would we not be allowed to use the contacts to our list without them saying yes, essentially?
So, legitimate interest is a little bit like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, it is a subjective thing. So it is down to go and look at the ICO. If you Google legitimate interest ICO, it brings you up a really clear page, and that will help answer that question for you. I though would think about not necessarily the GDPR implications here, but I would be thinking about the implications for what other people in the group might think and people who run that network might think. So I would probably tread a little bit more carefully there than I would do with something like LinkedIn, for example. Because on LinkedIn, they are my connections. It's between me and the connection, whether they like what I've done and whether I do it or not. But here we're introducing a third element, in this case, the Catena network. So I would tread more carefully there. And I would be probably having conversations with whoever runs that network about whether it's been done before, how they would feel about it, etc. Having said that, going back to what I put in my point about networking, if it's a group that you meet around the table with on a regular basis, weekly or monthly, I'd then be a little bit more aggressive, is not quite the right word, but I'd be more inclined to be on the front foot. That's a really rambling answer. I'm sorry, Dan.
No, that's fine. We'll take the answers rambling or concise. And then no more questions, but Helen mentioned that their newsletter is called the February update this month. So there's a few ways to word it without that word newsletter being in there.
Yeah, I think putting a date in there is good for the month. I also think, especially in the subject line of the newsletter, putting some of the topics that are being covered. So rather than just February newsletter or March update, putting some of the subject lines some of the topics into the subject line, and also that preview text. Preview text is incredibly useful, just to give people a flavour of what they might be getting, and therefore try and increase open rates a bit. Well, that's probably a different webinar. Right, number 9. Number 9. Okay, sending social messages before your newsletter goes out and just after your newsletter goes out. So if you are writing the newsletter yourself and writing the blogs that go in the newsletter yourself, or you're getting somebody else to do it for you, outsourcing, hint, hint, yardstick, and then write little social messages before the newsletter goes out and just after you've sent it. Here's an example. I sent this morning, putting the finishing touches to this week's blog. Be out on Friday, 7:30 a.m. If you'd like a copy, click the link in the image. There's the image, and that link goes to the newsletter sign-up page we talked about earlier. So that really does, again, tell people what's coming out. Remind those people who are already on your database that they're going to get it. Shows that you're writing about interesting things. And again, gives people an opportunity who are not on the database to sign up to it. And then a message afterwards, I might send a message at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning. We've just sent our newsletter to 8,156 people, or how many on the database right now. If you didn't get a copy, click the link, sign up, and we'll send it to you. So bookend your newsletter going out by telling people on social media what they're going to get and telling people on social media what you've just sent. And that works quite nicely. Another example of where you can use that landing page. Number 10, add people who register for your webinar to your newsletter database. So we monitor the number of people who sign up to our webinar. We monitor the number of people who attend. Not everybody who signs up attends. And we monitor the number of new people that have been added to our database for each webinar. And it's generally around 15 to 20%. And that's because we're promoting our webinar in lots of different places. So we promote it on social media. We promote it via our website. Phil Calvert, bless him, sent out a mailer yesterday to the members of his new group. Thank you, Phil, if you're on, promoting the webinar today. We promote our webinar in lots of different ways. And you would as well if you run webinars. And those 15 to 20% of people who are not already in our newsletter audience, guess what? They get added into our newsletter audience after they've signed up for a webinar. Of course, they then get future webinar invites as well. So add people who register to your webinar into your newsletter database. Right, a few things that will then grow newsletter databases really quickly. So one of the ways of turbocharging the growth of your newsletter database is a lead magnet campaign on social media. And this is essentially where you give away an asset of perceived high value, for example, a guide, in return for contact details, typically name, email address, and telephone number, if you ask for it. And often you see these on Facebook. Can use them on other social platforms. Need to be a little bit careful with LinkedIn. It can get really quite expensive. But you give the asset away. The form sits in Facebook. Somebody fills the form out. They get the guide and maybe a follow-up campaign, and you get their email address. A, to follow up, but B, to add into your newsletter database. So lead magnet campaigns can really quite quickly boost the size of newsletter databases and are typically the go-to, along with a couple of other things we're going to talk about in a bit, if you want a bulk increase. Another way of bulk increasing, bulk boosts, is buying data. So this works particularly well if you're targeting business owners, for example. Works even better if you're targeting a particular niche of business owners. But you can buy data, names, business names, email addresses, ideally fill at rather than info at email addresses. And it's relatively cost effective. Relatively cost effective. We've seen costs vary between about 300, 400, 500 per 1,000 lines of data. So it's pretty cost effective and gives you an immediate boost to your database. These people have never heard of you, so they do take some warming up. Yeah, you've got to be really super conscious about adding value to them. And most databases are actually, you need to repurchase them once a year. But if you've got a particular campaign, particular niche, and you don't currently have an audience, then buying data can really give you a very quick boost to the number of people who receive your newsletter, webinar invites, etc. If anybody wants a recommendation to a data broker, we've got a very good broker that we would recommend. Dan, anything come in on the chat or Q&A?
Yeah, funny you should say that you've got a good data broker that you can recommend, because one of the questions is from Chris, who says, where would you buy the data lists from and how do you find the right ones?
So we use a firm, we recommend a firm called Data Broker, and it's a chap called Gareth Perry. So if you just Google Gareth Perry Data Broker after this webinar, tell him I said hi, go and have a chat with Gareth.
Great question from Claire on buying data. Claire asks, if you buy data, do you have legitimate interest though?
Generally speaking, this data has consent attached to it. It generally has consent attached to it.
Cool. And then while we're in question mode, a question from Molly, who asks, could I add people who sign up to attend our events via Eventbrite?
I think so. I think you've got legitimate interest there, provided your privacy policy is correct. I think you have legitimate interest there. And that's a good point, actually. I've missed this off the slide, should have put it in. This is an important one. We talked about people who sign up for your webinar. That could equally be extended to events. So I can think of firms who have run stalls at their local village shows, food shows, that sort of stuff, where they have done, the old thing where you put a business card, bottle of champagne, pre-prize draw, that sort of stuff. I've seen firms do that. So again, providing you've got your privacy policy right, providing you've got legitimate interest in there, providing your added value, then yeah, go for it.
Brilliant. Let's carry on.
No worries, thank you. Right, number 13. So again, bulk boosts. LinkedIn Sales Navigator. So I have seen some firms, small number, but some firms go on to LinkedIn Sales Navigator, produce databases of people on LinkedIn, and then put it through AI or people per hour and produce a database that way. And it does provide a bulk boost. Again, these people are not known to you. So this is very similar to buying data. But it's people who are not known to you. And therefore, you need to add value very quickly. And you need to accept a higher than normal unsubscribe rate for the first few things that you send to them. There's not a problem with unsubscribes. People think unsubscribes are a bad thing. They're not. So using LinkedIn Sales Navigator plus a bit of AI, and there's a lot of tools that allow you to extract it from LinkedIn Sales Navigator, can again give you that bulk boost. And on LinkedIn Sales Navigator, there is a lot of different filters that you can add in, both location, job-wise, education, etc. It's really quite interesting to have a play around with it. So if you want that bulk boost, consider buying data, consider LinkedIn Sales Navigator, consider moving your LinkedIn connections across. Number 14, coming to the end. Piggybacking other people's audience. So guesting and piggybacking other people's audience. So that might be writing guest blogs. If you write a guest blog for them, they send it out to their audience. They might or might not, depending on what they do with their audience, hand you that audience over. They're probably more likely to put a call to action at the bottom. So if they take the call to action, someone can sign up to your newsletter. Appear on podcasts and webinars. So, for example, we've run webinars with various organizations where when someone signed up, both promote it. And when someone signed up, the notice said, well, the information, your email address will be shared with both parties, us and the people we were running the webinar with. And that boosted their database and it boosted our database. Appearing on other people's podcasts. If you're seen as an expert and people want to hear more from you, then if you get the call to action right, they might sign up for your newsletter as well. So find those opportunities to guest on blogs, on podcasts, on webinars. I'd put the call to action in or try and get the data shared afterwards. And continuing to piggyback other people's audiences. And this isn't strictly building your audience, but it is getting your newsletter out to a wider audience. Is send your newsletter to professional connections clients. So your professional connections, accountants and solicitors, see if you can come to an agreement with them where your newsletter can go out to their clients, either because you send it or they send it on your behalf. So this isn't, to say, strictly building your audience, but it is getting your newsletter out to a much wider audience. By speaking to your professional connections and thinking about how you can get your newsletter into their clients' inboxes. So find ways to piggyback other people's audiences. And there we have it. There we have it. So we've spoken about the reasons to grow your database. We've spoken about the two things you need to do to prepare. Make sure you're GDPR compliant, the standalone newsletter sign-up page. There's a special offer, 197 plus VAT, if anybody wants us to do that. Talked about the 15 ways to grow your newsletter audience. And hopefully you can take some of those away today and do them and give yourself a boost. Some of them will give you a regular boost. Others will give you a significant boost. For example, the stuff we talked about on LinkedIn and buying data. Before we get into questions, next month's webinar, 10 a.m. Wednesday, the 20th of March. The 23, very specific, the 23 indispensable elements of an advisor planner website. How many can you tick off? So that's going to be a checklisty style. We might even do a scorecard that you can get your website up and you can be checking whether you have each of those 23 indispensable elements. Dan, if you could just put a link into the chat so people can sign up for that immediately, if that's okay, if you've not already done it.
Yep, just done that.
And let's dive into any questions. By the way, if anybody wants to stay in touch with us, if you've not been there already, there's the website, my LinkedIn profile, email address, and Twitter. Dan, what have we got in the way of questions?
Okay, so first question I'll be able to answer is from Andy, who asks, where will I be able to find the replay of today's webinar? So for those of you that don't know, you'll be having a recording sent through to your inbox later on today, along with anything that we've mentioned that you might find useful. And then on to the next question. A good question in from Emily. With the Yardstick newsletter service, it is made clear to the clients that they can't just reply to the newsletter. I have had some issues with other newsletters where clients have replied directly thinking they can reach me. So what's best practice there, Phil?
So just going back to the first question, actually, I think it was Andy who asked about where you can get a copy of the webinar. Yeah, Dan's absolutely right. We'll send it to you today. But also, if you go onto our website, there's a free resources tab at the top. There's a drop down there that says videos, and all our previous webinars are on there. So you can go and watch those. The replying to an email newsletter is a good question. A very simple answer to that. In the system we use, which is .digital, and I'm sure it's similar to others, MailChimp and Constant Contact and that sort of stuff. In there, on the first page of the 5 build pages, there is a little data field that says who should be replies be forwarded to. So what we would ask our clients there is, right, who do you want any replies to be forwarded to? We put that email address in, and that means that if any clients reply to the newsletter, they are automatically forward to the person in your business who wants to deal with them. Also means you get the out of offices when that's done. So, for example, at Yardstick, my email address is in the forwarding box, and at Christmas I get about 600 out of offices. But that's absolutely fine because it means that I get the other messages. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, so next question in from Stephen, and I assume the answer to this is a big yes, of course. So Stephen asks, are you guys able to advise further about how to grow professional connections specifically?
Yeah, we can. So we can help with, there's three elements of professional connections. There's building or growing an audience, there's engaging the audience, and there's following up on intent signals, so that you can then get closer to the professional connection and they can start introducing their clients to you. So if you want to send us an email, we can book a meeting together and I can talk you through a bit more about each of those sections: growing the audience, engaging, and following up on intent signals.
Brilliant. And then great question in from Marina, who asks, you've mentioned many sources where you may be able to add people to a newsletter. However, I might be misunderstanding, but the ICO website suggests that you must collect clients' consent before adding them to any database. Could you clarify?
And go and read the legitimate interest page, on the ICO website, and go from there. There are 6 legal bases and say for processing someone's data. Go to the ICO website and have a look at that from a legitimate interest perspective.
Brilliant. Right. Now, that seems to be everything. So does anybody have any last minute questions, comments, queries that they want to get in the last 3 minutes we have left? If not, Phil's going to saw me in half. So please, come on, ask those questions.
Like Debbie McGee, mate, aren't you? For those people who can remember Paul Daniels and Debbie McGee years ago. Right. As I say, sign up for that next webinar. I'm really hoping that April's webinar, we have got a very special guest on, who has already appeared in lots of different places, including Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast. So that name will be revealed at next month's webinar. In the meantime, have a good rest of the day, guys. Hope this has been useful. See you next month. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.